Joe Biden's garbage comment and the reaction that immediately ensued from both sides, I think, encapsulates every single thing that is incorrect with American politics. So in this video, we're going to have a little conversation about this, and we're going to take some time to reflect on where we are right now as a country and where we are right now as Americans. And perhaps we're going to be able to think of some ways that we can grow beyond this point and fix what has been broken by morally uneducated leaders, by a terrible media system that feeds us mediocrity and feeds us nonsense, and also by a reactionary culture that does nothing to address the two problems I just mentioned. Before we get into that, my friends, hope you're doing well. I'm Christian Watt. Thanks so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe. Do whatever you can to get our message out there, even if you disagree with me. We are close to 20,000 subscribers, my friends. I'm so excited. I'm so grateful to have all of your patronage. I'm so grateful to have all of your support. You know, I'm just someone that is trying to do his best to contribute to the conversation and contribute to the process of restoring a sort of pro-American sentiment within the hearts and minds of people in this country who may have been challenged in their patriotism or who may be, being pessimistic about the future. So if that sounds good to you and you also want to kind of challenge yourself along the way, learn some new material, then I would encourage you to please subscribe, like, share, comment, tell your friends, tell your family, do whatever you can. Thank you guys so much for being here. Now, please enjoy the video. So, by now, many of you have seen the disastrous and grotesque comment that Joe Biden made about half of the country in response to the incident that happened at Madison Square Garden, where comedian Tony Hinchcliffe made a joke about Puerto Rico being a floating pile of garbage. Joe Biden then, on a Latino voter get out of the vote call, a Skype call, basically said that Trump supporters are garbage.
Or Puerto Rico, where I'm in my home state of Delaware, they're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. His demonization is seen as unconscionable, and it's un-American.
And this has created a reaction, unlike what I've seen in my time observing politics. I have seen people put on garbage bags and walk around saying, "Yeah, Joe Biden, I am garbage." I've seen people posting Oscar the Grouch memes. You guys may know Oscar from Sesame Street. I've seen people wearing garbage vests and going out to Halloween for that, going trick-or-treating for that. I've seen people going on in garbage bags to the polls to vote, so on and so forth. I've seen people embracing the label that Biden gave them. And as all this happened, I kind of stepped back and I thought a few things. First, when I saw Biden's comment for myself, I immediately thought, his one comment just encapsulates the problem of moral education that we have in this country. I've said for a very, very long time that the issue with our politics is not necessarily an issue of special interest or of money or anything like that. It's an issue of corruption, but not just any old kind of corruption. It's an issue of moral corruption born of ignorance or apathy. Because a politician is not simply someone who is meant to represent the positions that they ran on. A politician, first and foremost, in the American context, must be committed to the underlying principles that generate a basis and a legitimacy for the American government. That is the Constitution. That is what the Constitution also implies. So in other words, politicians must also have a sound moral understanding if they are to execute their job in the best way possible. The problem is most politicians have a very shallow moral understanding. Some have a moral understanding that is simply the premises that they've held for their entire life but are not really challenged. And others simply have a moral understanding that benefits them in a particular moment that they discard whenever it becomes inconvenient for them. In other words, they have no particular conviction. This is important because when you have a certain moral understanding of how to act, when your behavior is constrained by ethical norms, you're going to conduct yourself and you're going to think about the country, think about your constituents, think about politics in a much different way than if you're guided by a lack of moral understanding. And so we'll get to that in a second. But when I saw the reaction to what Biden said, I saw a different problem that is kind of propping up within the American mind. And I saw the effects of propaganda. You see, propaganda is not simply something that is produced by the media or produced by some nefarious person out there. Propaganda can be any bit of information that provokes you to change your habits or your behavior to conform to it, to conform to its intentions. So I was immediately reminded of a passage that I wrote from Edward Bernays. Bernays being the architect of American propaganda, Bernays being the person who quite literally was so proficient at propaganda that he crafted the American breakfast from scratch. The sort of bacon and eggs phenomenon directly comes from him, and that is now a staple of American culture. He was able to literally, this is rather a new phenomenon, to literally put this rather unhealthy, I think, but quintessentially American breakfast in front of our faces and sell it as quintessentially American. And for decades after that, we've kind of been subsumed with this idea of breakfast. So in the book Propaganda, where he kind of lays out his ethos, Bernays begins by saying the following: the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes are formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. Our invisible governors are, in many cases, unaware of the identity of the fellow members of their inner cabinet. And he goes on to lay out his rationale as to why he believes propaganda should be the organizing principle of society. Now, let me just say this. I obviously reject Edward Bernays' vision of society. A society that is organized by propaganda and manipulation, but is not based on truth and a clear connection to reality, is a society of slaves, a society of people who are not enlightened, a society of people who cannot understand the world, and much less understand themselves, and therefore a society that is destined towards chaos. So I fundamentally reject this opening vision that Bernays lays out. Having said that, in a practical sense, he is correct in that this is how a lot of our politics and our media operate, and many people are beginning to recognize this. But oftentimes, those that are beginning to recognize this don't recognize when it's being done to them. When your enemy, when your adversary tells you something, you don't take that and internalize it or try to reclaim it in order to prove them wrong. You reject their vision of you, and you assert your vision of you, or the correct vision rooted in something beyond you, and you let that be your North Star. But what a lot of people did, and this is some criticism I have from my own side, what a lot of folks did, they took Joe Biden's garbage comment, and they embraced it as they would embrace someone they care about, and they internalized it in a way to say, Biden, you're not going to tell me what I am. I'm gonna beat you by simply saying that I am garbage, and I'm gonna wear it proudly as I go and vote for your opponent. Well, this may seem like a victory, but in all reality, at this moment, you are fighting on the terms of the people that don't like you. You're fighting on the terms of the people that view you as a disgrace. You're fighting on the terms of the people that are trying to manipulate you with their words. And at that point, you have ceded ground to the manipulators. You have ceded ground to the rhetoricians. You have ceded ground to the callous politicians that don't care about our country and that disregard an entire portion of the population they have a caricature of, when in all reality, they should have a deep understanding of that part of the population, and they should have a charitable opinion to that part of the population. We'll get to the idea of charitability in a second here. So that's the problem, and that's one of the, and by the way, me saying this has gotten me attacked on social media, it's gotten me criticized. Well, Christian, you're just speaking word salad. Christian, how could you say this? I'm saying it because if we're going to have a strong country, we must have a strong sense of self. And to have a strong sense of self, we must have an unassailable identity. And to have an unassailable identity, we must not let words and barbs and arrows from our foes, from those who seek to destroy us, remake us into their own image, even if it's in a way to defy them. You defy evil, not by embracing evil or flirting with evil or dealing with evil in an intimate way. Because when you put a garbage thing on your body, when you put a garbage vest on your body, when you say, I am garbage, you are embracing evil. When you do that, you don't win. You give them what they want. They have the ability to change your self-perception. They therefore have the ability to in some way control you. Just like Bernays said, our minds are molded and our tastes are formed, our ideas are suggested. Don't let that be you. But on to Biden, because I find him more interesting in this regard. Because look, people will do what they want to do. I understand that. Although I think that there is the right thing to do, and there's the wrong thing to do, and there's the wise thing to do. Biden's comment actually shows, I think, as mentioned, a lack of moral education. And it demonstrates why it is important for every president of the United States to share some very basic cardinal virtues by which society would be impossible. So here's what I mean. Society is sustained not by law, not by positive law that comes from government. Society is sustained by moral law. Society is sustained by basic norms and ethics and customs that are generated upon a basis of a moral objective law. We call it this natural law, by which our relations are ordered in a manner that is conducive to the preservation of the social peace, that is conducive to the functioning of society in the best way possible. But beneath those very basic rules are also guidelines of conduct that help enhance the functioning of society in a way that goes beyond just its mere preservation and goes towards its flourishing. And these are the personal virtues that all of us should indeed embrace. And by saying what he said, Biden shows that he lacks three cardinal virtues by which a society, it can operate without these virtues, but it must have these virtues in order to be a good society. He lacks liberality. Now, George Washington said in his letter to the Hebrew congregation that the liberality of sentiment that he saw in the country was wonderful, and it was quintessentially American. And what he meant by liberality of sentiment, he simply meant our willingness to be open and entertain other ideas with a mindset towards the social peace. He lacks charitability. Now, charitability and liberality are two corollaries of each other. But charitability goes even further than that. And charitability says, okay, I'm open-minded already, but now I'm going to give you credit for your argument. I'm going to take the best version of your worldview. I'm going to try to interpret it in my own language so I can understand you. So whereas liberality is the first step, charitability is the second, third, and fourth steps of social understanding and of epistemic humility. Then we have the third virtue that Joe Biden doesn't have, and that is the virtue of goodwill. So I'm not just going to have an open mind towards you. I'm not just going to construe your arguments and your worldviews and your claims in the best way possible, but I'm also going to go ahead and I'm going to will the good for you. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to will that you have the best kind of life you can have. I'm going to will the best for you. I'm going to have a certain kind of notion in my heart that you as my fellow neighbor, you as my fellow human being should have a good life. You as my fellow human being should be someone who should be prosperous. You as a fellow human being should be someone who can be trusted, so on and so forth, unless you show me that the trust is misplaced, so on and so forth. These are basic virtues without which you have a society of people that may be functioning, but they're not trustworthy, they're not kind, and they're not tolerant. In other words, you don't really have a society. You have a entire environment of people that are potential antagonists. And enmity is the enemy of cohesion. Cohesion is the glue by which societies stick together. Now, when the president, who possesses symbolic power by virtue of his position in office, by virtue of the mantle he carries as President of the United States, utters a negative word in absence of those virtues, he deteriorates society because his words go through several phases of dissemination. Then you have the media. You have the White House, you have his party and his apologists within the ground floor trying to justify him, and then you have the ground floor of society reacting. In a society where you have a reactionary culture, symbolic power becomes almost indispensable to moving society one way or the other. They call this the bully pulpit, but I don't like that term because it's not always a tool of bullying or a tool of asserting dominance, which is what that suggests. Sometimes it's simply a tool of moving the social discourse around just by virtue of the authority and status you possess. That's another problem we have to look at as Americans. Old world Europe and old worldism, which was the philosophy that America rejected by virtue of its founding, and by virtue of rooting value not in status, not in power, but instead in the character of individuals, but instead in the habits and beliefs of individuals, but instead in the source of natural law. Old worldism would have us believe that status should confer all these kind of things upon us in society. And I think that many of us still have an old world mindset when we treat our presidents and our politicians in a way where their words have more weight than they should. Now, obviously, as a practical concern, the president has a lot of power, and his words obviously can move markets, things like that. But just because that's how it happens does not mean it should be so. If we're really going to save our country from those who hate it, if we're really going to defend the ethos of the Constitution, which is not just its letter and its words, but its meaning, it's what it implies, we have to see our politicians in a different way. And we must not be reactionary. Ultimately, though, the president does have this kind of power over society. And if that's going to be the case, he must understand what it takes to preserve society. And that means he must go follow the virtues that I mentioned. Or else his words can be injurious not just to society, but fundamentally to his own standing as president. Because the president is enabled by the consent of the governed. The president does not enable the government, unlike what some presidents in the past, like FDR, Woodrow Wilson, or Barack Obama, believe they did. One last point here, my friends. A classically Republican system, which is what America has, was meant to filter out the passions of the masses and to provide the minority, provide the people that may not be powerful in the faces of crowds, a recourse to be defended against the passions of the masses. But when passions infiltrate the structure of the republic, and they are at the highest point of the structure of the republic, like they were with Biden's comment, and like they've been, by the way, with Biden's repeated behaviors towards people he disagrees with, like going in front of a red backdrop and calling half the country MAGA Republicans and saying that they're evil. When the passions infiltrate the structure of the structure becomes overloaded, and it can no longer filter out the passions, because the passions now have a seat at the highest table in the structure. We must demand more from our leaders. What we saw with Biden's garbage comment is simply a result of a lack of moral education, a lack of ethical misunderstanding, of understanding, a lack of understanding of virtue. When we correct these things and we demand more, we won't have a perfect system. We'll never have a perfect system because men are fallible. But we'll have a better system, a better standard of leadership, which produces better leaders. But until then, if we're just going to be a reactionary culture that soaks up all this stuff like sponges, that wears garbage over our body to kind of deflect the criticism or whatever, that falls in steps with, as bernays said, the men that try to mold our minds and shape our taste and give us ideas that may not be good, and we're not rigorous as we should be, then I think we're going to get the kind of leadership we deserve, the kind of political order we deserve, and the kind of society we deserve, which is not a good political order, not a very good society, and most certainly not virtuous leaders. That's my message. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can. Study history, my friends, study philosophy, do whatever you can to make sure we're successful, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.